Okay, no problem. While you do that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick introduction. Guys, so pleased that Chris is joining us, and hopefully you had a chance to read a little bit about his background, but if not, I want to give you just a very abbreviated version of this. Chris is a former Royal Marine, and amongst the other places that he was deployed was Northern Ireland during the time of the Troubles, and so he has certainly had some combat experience, and that may have affected some of his actions later on in life. We'll talk more about that when we get into the question and answer period with him. But in the mid-90s, after he left the Royal Marines, he came to Hong Kong, where we are right now, to make his fortune, but things didn't turn out so well. He began using, and then he became dependent on one of the most powerful stimulants that the world has ever seen, crystal methamphetamine. Now, during this time period, this is the mid-90s before Hong Kong's handover to the Chinese, Chris takes on a series of odd jobs. He becomes one of the most interesting ones was he became a nightclub doorman for the 14K Triads, one of the most notorious Triad groups. And he was working in Wan Chai's red light district. So he was meeting a lot of interesting characters at the time. And in addition to what he was seeing, he was also experiencing some things that were beginning to spin out of his control. His meth use got progressively worse, developed a tolerance for it, as you do with many different drugs. And Chris began to hallucinate and eventually experienced, what's termed as a drug psychosis, which is actually, a literal break with reality. Being able to determine what's real and what's not real becomes very difficult for the user at the time. So imagine doing these jobs, working for the 14K Triads in the Wan Chai's red light district, and already you're having difficulty holding on to reality because of the drug use that you're involved in. His eventual breakdown prompted him to go back to his home in the UK, but as many people who have been involved with drugs know, addiction doesn't necessarily respect geographic borders. It travels with you if you haven't dealt with the underlying issues beneath them. And his addiction followed him back to the UK. But Chris's time with the Royal Marines taught him never to quit, and he began a journey of self-discovery, examining both the childhood trauma as well as the post-traumatic stress that he experienced in places like Northern Ireland and other deployments with the Royal Marines that may have impacted some of the choices that he was making in his use of crystal meth, self-medication, if you would. And Chris, over time, began to come to terms with this, began to understand what some of the underlying reasons were. And also, he did something that we as journalists, find very therapeutic as well. He began to write down his experiences. He began to create a memoir for those. And eventually, so far, we expect more books from him. He wrote 2 books, Eating Smoke, which came out in 2011, one of the first books I read when I came to Hong Kong. And more recently, 40, there it is, I see it. If you can see him, he's holding that. More recently, I'm holding up 40 Nights, which was his follow-up to that. And that detailed more of his experiences when he returned to the UK. Now, that's one part of Chris' life, but it's not all of it. In that time period after writing these memoirs, he also embraced the adventurer that was always inside of him, obviously being a Royal Marine and the challenges that it takes to actually get that coveted beret. He became a qualified pilot, a skydiver, an ultramarathoner. He's taken parts in expeditions all over the world. I think something like 80 countries, right, Chris, so far? Okay, yeah, more than most of us would actually travel on vacation or holiday. And in 2018, he ran across the UK, thousands of kilometers, to raise awareness for veteran suicide.
They think that people that have suffered a mental health condition called addiction, that they choose to do that. And of course, if you saw the situation, and I know you've read my books, Kevin, thank you. The situation I got in Hong Kong, I was working for a criminal gang. They very easily, either they could have killed me or I would have killed myself through my dangerous behavior. I was running around the roofs of the skyscrapers and doing all kinds of quite serious stuff. You know, I'd run straight across the traffic using like my peripheral vision, if that's the right word, or the opposite. You know, just quite extreme stuff. And I ended up so mentally unwell that I was like the crazy guy walking down the street that everybody moved away from. So what I always say to people is like, do you really think I chose that?
Chris, let's back it up a little bit. I mean, you know, you mentioned initially that you took your first drink of alcohol at age 12. Did you know then that these kind of psychoactive substances had a different effect on you than it did from your peers? You know, did you feel like even at that age, you knew that perhaps they held an allure that they didn't hold for everyone?
No, it wasn't like that, Kevin. Sorry, I tend to talk around the houses a lot. It's just, there's no one in life, there's just no one simple way of understanding, as I'm sure you know, and it's hard for me to compartmentalize what is such a complex mix of psychosocial, biological, chemical, and all the other things that go with it. But no, I took my first drink probably like a lot of people. I got drunk, I was laughing, I fell over in the shower. It was all hilarious, you know. I liked it. I like that feeling that you can make yourself happy by taking a chemical, in this case, alcohol. I never like was bang, bang, right, let's go and get a drinking problem. I was very moderated. I did the whole of the rave scene. You know, I was in the military, so I couldn't lose the plot in the way I did in Hong Kong. And it wasn't that I couldn't, because like I say, you don't have a choice in these matters. You follow your destiny, right? Or your destiny takes you. But it was when I did that crystal meth in that office for the first time, looking back, I would say it felt like the key in the lock for me. So one of them, or probably the biggest driver behind addiction, is childhood trauma. This is why so many of us from my generation who were abused as children, you know, when I grew up, any adult could come and hit you, and they didn't even have to have a reason why they wanted to do it. That was just, it was the 70s in Britain. Someone would come and smack you. Maybe they thought you were another kid that had like been knocking on their door. You know, we call it cherry knocking, right? Something like this. But still, the point is no human being should be able to just go and physically abuse anybody, let alone a child. And this was normal when I grew up. So I grew up very damaged, very scared, very afraid, feeling like, why do I feel different to everybody? And of course, a lot of my cohort felt this way too. When I tried crystal meth, all those feelings were gone. I didn't feel scared, anxious, different. I felt absolutely brilliant, beyond what any words, even in my book, can describe. It was as if all of my fears and my worries were gone. I felt like Chris Thrall. This is me. I feel amazing. I felt energy. I felt cool. I felt handsome. I felt in control. I felt that anything I want to do, anything, which is why I used to like do handstands on top of the skyscrapers, looking down at the cars. Is I just had this amazing sense of control, and to a degree control, because, you know, otherwise I would have fallen off, right? Now, looking back, I guess that you don't realize when you carry trauma. You when you're young, you just think you're normal like everybody, but you feel these things inside you without even realizing it. So when I took the crystal meth and we smoked it on some silver foil and we sucked it up through, I think it was a banknote or a rolled up piece of foil. Unbeknown to me, that's taken me to a level where I can feel just free of that trauma, Kevin, you know, free of those adults like hitting me, abusing me, whatever it was. I'm free. Well, that's a very dangerous place to be, because what do you want to do the next day? Well, you want to be free again. So what do? You go over to Chungking Mansions and you buy some more of the drug, right? Or you find someone who sells it because you want to feel this amazing feeling. When that feeling goes, and as I know the class must all know, you have the come down. So then you feel even worse than you felt before because you're down there now. Then it becomes even more important to try to get some more of this drug, and it might be alcohol, it might be, you know, cigarettes, ecstasy, cocaine, might be, for a lot of people it's food, for some people it's sex, it can be any medium. In my case it was crystal meth, and you get into this pattern, and this pattern is called addiction. And how do you know when you're in addiction? Well, you know, and I say this because I'm a substance misuse specialist, so this is not only a job I do a little bit now with people, but I actually worked in a clinic for 3 years, mainly dealing with problematic heroin users and the methadone program, but also every other drug as well. And our
Chris,
definition...
If I could just drill down on that point for a second, you know, and
Sure.
we talk about this in the lecture that we just recorded, cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamine, is that methamphetamine is such a potent stimulant that your brain is flooded with dopamines probably more than any other drug that's out there. They end up saturating your synaptic cleft, you know, neurologically. And so when those disappear, as you mentioned, the come down is brutal. And so it creates this cycle. What were you actually chasing? Were you chasing the high, or were you just trying to avoid the come down when you feel like your use and abuse moved more into the addiction area?
Oh, great question, Kevin. And it's like I say, there's never one easy answer. It's always a combination of the two, right? So for example, with the stimulant, the withdrawal or the come down is more in terms of tiredness, depression, lack of wanting to do anything because you've been up there and now you're down here. It's very different to say opiates. Opiates, I mean heroin, morphine, this kind of thing. That physically changes your brain's chemistry, the opiates do, which means your body stops producing certain chemicals. And when you get off heroin or opiates, you physically go into pain. I've been on lots of painkillers through my misadventures, and it's one of the most frightening, horrible things to do. Far worse than amphetamines and far worse than crystal meth. Crystal meth, my biggest problem was when I'd been on it for say 10 days, maybe 20 days. And sometimes, I mean, one time I didn't sleep for 9 days. And on that 10th day, when I tried to come off the drug, I mean, I was exhausted beyond anything I could ever explain to anybody. More exhausted than if I climbed Mount Everest without oxygen. I couldn't do any. All I could do is lie down and sleep. I couldn't function. It gets like in your cells. It's really an extreme form of tiredness. You just are so groggy. It's not like you can go, cup of coffee, cold shower, let's go to work. It's, you know, you can't do that. But in the early days, when I was just taking, say, 100 Hong Kong dollars worth, which was about 1/10 of a gram, so enough to sort of smoke maybe 12 or 13 of these tiny little crystals, like salt. I'd stay up all night. I'd be very manic. I'd be drawing, writing, all this kind of stuff. And then in the morning, it would start to wear off. By the end of the day, I was getting very tired. And then I would sleep, wake up the next day, and I didn't feel massively anything, Kevin, you know, but of course you're not here anymore. You're just down here a little bit. And you slowly get back up after, say, 2 or 3 days. And then for me, I would just think, should we get some more of that crystal meth again? And that's it. When that thought is in your head, it's triggering your synapses in your brain. You can't go back then. Once you've had that thought, it's like you've got to live out this, they call it acting out. So there I would, over to Chunky Mansions, as well, you know from my book. So.
In the neuroscience research that they've done on that very thought that you said, the idea of getting the drug triggers as many dopamines as taking the drug itself to some extent. You're beginning the process of fulfilling, you know, that craving. And that's where they say addiction really begins to start. Chris, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, as things progress, you know, you're obviously losing sleep and so on, but at a certain point, the break with reality begins to happen. You begin to feel that there are bugs in your skin. This is one of the symptoms of excessive use of methamphetamine. You begin to see things that aren't there. You hallucinate, but also, you know, very destructively, that there are bugs in your skin. You pick at them, and all the before and after photos that we see of some users, they start out being fairly attractive individuals, and then by the end, they've destroyed themselves. How did it happen for you? What was the process for you? At one point, I know in 40 Nights, you did talk about infestations and so on, but in those early days in Hong Kong, did you also experience that?
Yeah, I did once in Hong Kong. You'll probably remember there was one time I thought I had head lice. That was back when I had hair to have head lice in. I don't have that privilege anymore. But what it is, Kevin, and this again, this is a very misunderstood part of the medical world, is you got to remember you're putting very strong chemicals in your body, and your body has to eject them, right? And what do we know? Well, we know that it comes out in your urine, your saliva, but also we eject toxins through our skin, right? It's one of the biggest ways the body can get rid of, substances, no matter what they might be. Now, what happens is you're taking so much of these horrible chemicals. You know, this is stuff that's made in some factory in, you know, somewhere. You shouldn't really be putting them in your body. And they come out, when they come out through your skin, they make you very itchy. At the same time, you're extremely tired because you haven't slept for days. So you're hallucinating. So, you know, you're looking at, say, a picture, and the picture is a dog. And in your mind, and I won't pretend I understand the science, but in your mind, you're seeing something that's just not a dog. I was going to say cat, but that's too obvious.
Do you know that you're hallucinating, Chris? Do you know that this isn't reality at this point?
Yeah. Hallucination is very different to mental health, to psychosis. For example, one time in Hong Kong, in Wan Chai, in my apartment, I thought I saw a clown, like a circus clown, coming out of the floor, and I stared at it. It was amazing. I just watched this clown come out the floor, and then when I stood up and I walked over, it wasn't. It was just it was a shirt, you know. It was a shirt, but the way it was positioned, and because of my tiredness, and I'm looking at this shirt, and it just took on the appearance of a clown. Now, once I saw it was a shirt, I'm like, okay, you know. I kind of knew there wasn't a clown in my room in Wan Chai, right? That's a hallucination. And a lot of people like taking trippy drugs because of that very reason. They see things in a different way, and it's all kind of temporary. Psychosis is very different because psychosis, just a simple way to explain it, and I've heard very different views on this. Some almost seem a bit bizarre, but just a simple way is you're taking so much of this foreign chemical into your brain that it starts to overload your brain's natural function. So if your brain, you have your synapses firing like this normally, after a while, when you've taken crystal meth, and we're talking maybe 2 months, 3 months, for some people it can be quicker, you start to do this. And it's not firing right. And you're getting the wrong signals. You're interpreting the signals in the wrong way. So I stared at some cats for about 6 hours, just looking at cats in the street. And I was thinking that they were puppets. And I genuinely 100% believed these are puppets. These aren't cats. They're cats, but they're puppet cats, right? And that's the difference between, hallucinating and psychosis. Psychosis is a form of mental illness, whereas hallucination is a temporary state that's, for me, was a temporary state brought on by tiredness. That's not to say that mental health conditions, you can't hallucinate, but that's not really my kind of experience, if that makes sense.
Sure. Chris, we're starting to get some questions from students. I'd like to open it up to them a little bit.
Sure.
Bounce around. Santiago, you have a question here you want to ask Chris directly?
Yeah, sure. So Kevin mentioned that you also had to deal with PTSD because you were a Marine during the troubles in Ireland. How did you deal with that, in the sense of, like, did it make you more likely to use the drugs? And, like, once you realized that you didn't want to continue that cycle, if it made you use more drugs, how did you solve that, I guess, cycle? Like, did you go to therapy or? Yep.
Thank you, Santi. That's a brilliant question. So I should first just clarify, my PTSD, my trauma, was from my childhood.
Oh, okay.
No. Look, most people, that when they hear my story, they think Marine must have PTSD. He's been in combat, he's got PTSD. And what has happened is the media then run with that story. So that's where people hear it. They see an article about me, and that, people are not to know, right? So, and sometimes I don't even try and explain. It's just too complicated, because I do a lot of work with veterans, and I try to prevent this kind of wave of veteran suicides we have in the UK and America now. People just think that I must have had PTSD from my service too. So no, my trauma went back to my childhood, but it's exactly the same. Trauma is trauma, right? It causes the same symptoms. People's experience of it You know, the cause of it can be different, you know. For example, many military people have PTSD, but because there's no science behind it, there's been no studies into this area. I mean, really minimal studies, which if you think about it, if you want to send young men off to, you know, get damaged in war, you don't really want to understand what happens to them when they come home, right? Because then you've got to get more people to go and fight your next war. So what happens to a lot of us servicemen is we joined up because we had trauma. So I joined up thinking I could prove myself. I'd be a man if I had a gun and I did the tough tests. Had they asked me to kill someone, I would have just gone and done it. You know, you really are young, dumb, and brainwashed in that respect. So what happened is through my drug experience, it dragged up all these emotions that I'd never had before, and these thoughts that I never had dealt with before. And the way I worked through it, to answer the second part of your question, is I very quickly realized the medical community wasn't for me. They kind of made me worse because they didn't know what they're talking about. They hadn't had the experiences that I'd had. I went later on in life, when I started drinking too much, I went to one of these AA meetings. I found that a really uncomfortable experience. I didn't like being branded with a name, a stigmatic name, addict, because, you know, I'm a pilot, I'm a skydiver, I'm a best-selling author, I'm a global traveler, I'm an extreme endurance athlete, I'm a proud father, I'm a happy partner. You know, the list goes on and on and on. Why do you just want to call me one thing that I've done, which is be addicted? You know, why do you want to call me addict, right? So I was in these AA meetings and they don't understand all this stuff. So they will use words like, hey, hi, my name's Chris and I'm an addict. It's like, I couldn't be dealing with that. So that wasn't an option for me. So I just worked it out myself. And I still work it out myself. Every single day, I try to learn about life, spirituality, balance, happiness, how to be a better person, how to be better in my relationships with people, how to keep my substance misuse or my substance use under control. And the way I did it back then is I was just really honest with myself. And I'd really encourage anyone to read my second book rather than my first. I mean, read both of them if you want to get a good understanding. But in my second book, 40 Nights, I talk about when I had that moment of enlightenment that I suddenly realized this behavior, this drug taking, addictive behavior, like, it's got to stop, because it's not getting me this happy place that I used to be when I used to go dancing and I used to draw my pictures and write. It's not doing that anymore. It's, my life has just gone down and down and down and down. When you hit that rock bottom, which is why some people criticize, for example, the methadone program, because by giving people a drug, you're stopping them hitting the rock bottom, Santi. So when I hit my rock bottom, I realized, hang on, I can't go anymore. Either I stay here and die, or I make some changes in my life. And it was at that moment that, you know, Mother Nature gave me the power to see the world through a much better vision. And that allowed me to understand relationships, because to understand myself, I needed to know why my parents were like they were. Why did my parents behave in these ways when I was just a child? Why did they? So to understand them, I had to look at their parents, my grandparents. I had to look at the era that they grew up in, which was very weird in many ways, you know, the things they were taught and they believed, and, you know, men don't cry, and women should just clean the house and shut up, you know, very strange way of being. And I had to understand that. I didn't have to go any further, because that is enough to suddenly realize, hang on, it wasn't my parents' fault. They didn't know any different. They were brainwashed to be like this to me. They had their own psychological issues. They, you know, they weren't like picking on me personally. They would have behaved like this to anyone. So it's not about me anymore. And by doing that, I freed myself of this trauma. You know, I looked at...
Chris, if I could interject, I've got a stack of questions that people want to get to you.
Okay,
so I do want to run out of time here.
Yeah.
So
I'll be quicker now.
Uday, what's your question for Chris?
Thanks, Kevin. So like my question is like sort of like a comparison between like your current life and like your life in the point where you were actually like addicted to crystal meth. So like right now, as like Kevin mentioned, and upon like doing like side bit of research, I realized that you've been a lot into like adventure sports and like doing extreme things and like driving all the way from Norway to India and back. So would you say like, you know, that's like a more constructive way that you've like intrigued yourself into to like, you know, make your dopamine levels rise, like, you know, try and cope up with what you were earlier?
Yeah, Uday, brilliant. Yes, I agree with you. I mean, don't get me wrong. I loved taking drugs. I still would do now. It's just they don't work for me anymore. You know, even I have one beer with my friend, I just feel so bad about myself. I have the hangover the next day. I can't work, you know, I can't do my work to the level I want, right? So when you realize that that stuff doesn't really help you, it does for a very short time, then you have to look at other areas of life where you can get not just that happiness, but even more. This is why you hear people talking about Eastern philosophy and spirituality and happiness and you know. So now, yes, I love driving to India. I love traveling. I like adventure sports. But I can also be happy if I was sat in a little box, you know, this big, in the dark. We are all just, without trying to get too deep, you know, we're all just molecules in the universe. That's all we are. You know, we've been given this illusion that we have, we're individual because through evolution we have this, you know, juices, and at the end of the day, we're all just carbon molecules. And once you understand that as your bottom dollar, you know, it's very hard to be unhappy then, you know. Because for a start. So I hope that answers your question.
And we'll actually show everybody a video of Chris jumping out of a plane, not just like a normal person would jump out of a plane, but doing backflips when we're done with the session today. Adrenaline is still part of his makeup, certainly. Imad, do you have a question for Chris? No. Victoria, you've got a question for Chris?
I would like to know, have you ever been under influences from more than one kind of psychoactive substances? For example, like drinking alcohol with amphetamine. If so, how did you feel at that time? That kind of like the substances together.
Oh, Victoria, that's another wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I'll be completely honest. When I've been in, let's call it party mode, so maybe I'm at a friend's house, we've been out dancing all evening, we've been taking ecstasy, drinking non-stop, really. You know, we're talking like 12 beers or something. 3 ecstasy pills, you go back to, we call it after party, to somebody's house. And if you're lucky, someone's got some cocaine, so you're just snorting, you know, as many lines of cocaine as you can get. It's very expensive in the UK, and, you know, pretty much in Hong Kong too, from what I remember. And yeah, and even back in my dance days, so we're talking in the 90s, I'd even take an LSD trip, you know, at some point in that evening. Basically, anything to get messed up. You know, when I say messed up, I'm you know, as high as possible, and anything to keep that high going as long as I could. So when most people went to bed, like, my mind's too happy here, like, I want to keep this going. The second part of your question, when you mix one chemical with another, you get a third chemical, and that's a different high. So one thing that's very popular here in the UK now is people will snort cocaine and go drinking. And that combination, Kevin, you might know the word for it, it produces methyl alcohol or some name like this. It's a third chemical that gets you high again. So you can have like maybe 5 different highs from 5 different drugs, all working like as one, and it just kind of takes you like this way. Hope that answers your question, Victoria.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Mikhail, you have a question for Chris? Mikhail?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
Hey, Chris, you mentioned that up to a certain age, you didn't know you had childhood trauma and assumed that you were normal. So my question is, how did you identify your own childhood trauma so we can know how we can identify our own childhood trauma if we have any?
Mikhail, that is such a brilliant question. It's really upsetting as well, because, you know, there will be people with us today that are suffering trauma and, like you say, don't know it. All I would say, the first thing I must say is, I've had the best life ever. In fact, I'd go one step further without trying to sound rude or arrogant. I think I've had a better life than anyone I've ever met. I don't regret anything that I've ever done, with the exception of I've hurt a couple of people, but that's, you know, I'd be a bit of an asshole if I didn't regret hurting people, right? But so I say that because if you are suffering trauma, or you later find out that you are, it's not the end of the world. It's Mother Nature's, it's almost like a gift to you when you work it out and come out the other side, because you come out stronger, happier, healthier, more productive, cleverer. Cleverer with respect to knowing more about the world. So, you know, it's very wrong in our society, in our Western kind of thinking, that we think that like addiction is a bad thing. For me, it was a gift. It gave me my life back. You know, it sent me on a short challenge. It was hard, but then it gave me my life back. And I'm not saying here that people should run out and try and get addicted or take drugs. I say study spirituality is a much more healthier way of getting happy. It's not about happiness, it's about balance, right?
Right.
So I always encourage anyone, get to a point in your life where you get a high, but you kind of keep it like in the middle. You get a low, but you can lift it up. and try and go through the middle, it's because being enlightened is not necessarily about being happy, because things are going to happen to you every day that make you unhappy. It's about knowing how to deal with it and not letting it affect your mood. So how can people identify if they've got trauma? I was in a room once in a business meeting. There was about 50, maybe 100 people in the room. And the speaker said, right, hands up, who feels different? And he put his hand up, right? This guy was a millionaire. It was back when I thought money was like going to make me happy, right? Yeah. And he put his hand up, and I put my hand up. And then I looked around this hotel room, where the meeting was, and there was only 2 people in that room that had their hand up, me and the speaker. And he wasn't saying who feels special. He was saying who feels different, like, you know, just a bit different. And maybe that was an indicator that I was suffering, or you know, you don't always suffer trauma. It's just like it's in you. Another way you can tell is,
Chris, I hope you don't mind me moving you along a little bit. I've got so many people that want to ask you questions. I want to try to get as many as I possibly can. Krishna, you've got a question for Chris?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
hello.
Yeah, hi. Chris, what I want to ask you is, I saw this movie a few days ago called The Beautiful Boy. It's about a young kid trying to escape the addiction of crystal meth. And
Yeah, I know it.
yeah, in that movie, they often say that it's not really about wanting to quit. It's about being unable to quit even if you try to, because of how your brain chemistry changes and stuff due to the addiction. So
Yes.
yeah, they also said that the recovery rate for crystal meth addicts was like in the low 1% or 2%. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think you did differently that 98% of other people who failed recovery would have also tried to do but failed?
Okay, let's put this in perspective. Not everyone that tries crystal meth will be addicted. Most people will just go, oh, that's okay. And then they'll go on with their life, right? They won't be interested, because then they have a different psychological makeup. People who are happy can go, oh, yeah. You got to remember, so I try not to get off the question. So not everyone's going to get addicted. For those people like myself that do that it does trigger the addiction that's already in it. Remember, the addiction is already in you. There's a popular misconception that drugs cause addiction. And if the way I try to explain this is by saying that's like buying a new car and saying that car keeps making me have speeding tickets, right? Of course, the car can't make you have speeding ticket. What the car can do is awaken these feelings inside you that make you go out and get speeding tickets. The drug and addiction are very separate things. Addiction is a mental health condition. The drug is a drug. It's always been here since we were caveman living in the jungle or in the wild. There's always been drug. They're always going to be here. So we need to change our relationship with addiction, right? For these people that you mentioned that say, oh, I can't get off it, I can't. Well, most of them do eventually, because eventually you get bored with it. Your life becomes so rubbish, like in my case, rubbish because of it, you know, garbage. You get older and you just get sensible and you have a family and you have children, and Mother Nature, I say Mother Nature, some people will say God, some people will say the spirit, whatever your thing is, Mother Nature will give you the answers. She will eventually give you the answers to work your way through this addiction, right? And you will relapse. relapse, you know, go back in the cycle of addiction. I'm sure you're familiar with Prochaska and De Clemente's cycle of change. It's the single biggest model in addiction that I'd encourage everybody to understand. It's normal to relapse and go back a step or two, because that's when you learn why you wanted to go forward in the first place. And yeah, it's
Chris, let me just move us forward just a little bit. I still have a whole pile of questions. I apologize for interrupting you, but Justin has a question for you now.
Yeah, so my question to you, Chris, is that I understand with your history in the military that there is a certain degree of toxic masculinity. So, for example, not being able to, or not being comfortable to talk about your trauma or your emotional experiences, having to put on a front of masculinity where, you know, you have to be, you have to show everyone else that, you know, you're stronger than them. And especially because the Royal Marines, I understand, is an elite, is an elite part of the force. So do you think that your experiences in the military worsened the sort of trauma that you experienced in your childhood? And ultimately, did that contribute to why you used and abused drugs?
Fantastic, Justin. Yeah, everything that you just said is completely my experience. Obviously, there's a massive drug problem in the British military because alcohol, which is the worst drug, way worse than crystal meth. Alcohol and cigarettes are the two worst drugs. That surprises a lot of people. The reason I can tell you that is, as a specialist, you help people get off all the other drugs, but the two drugs that most people can't get off is the alcohol and the cigarettes, right? Toxic masculinity, yeah, of course, you know, you're not encouraged to talk about your feelings. Of course you're not, because that's seen as a sign of weakness. When you come out of the military and you have these PTSD, maybe from childhood, or maybe from Afghanistan, or maybe your childhood and Afghanistan, right? You know, or combination, you can't go to your buddies and go, look, I've got a drug problem. I need help because, or I got a drink problem. I need help, because you're indoctrinated that is a sign of weakness, right? These are all the things that are wrong in the military culture. And yeah, when I served, I got bullied, because that's just, you know, if you're in a team of 150 men or not 90 men, there's always going to be one guy that doesn't like you, and he's going to try and make your life miserable if he's damaged anyway, which a lot of military people are, you know, not that happy. Yeah, definitely probably made my situation worse, even though I didn't maybe realize at the time. Great question.
Mithil, you have a question for?
Yeah, hi. So after experiencing a variety of drugs yourself and also being in the military, so do you think that by making, let's say, substances like marijuana available to those in the military while in combat or after the combat, like being a veteran, let's say, help them cope with the trauma and the stress?
Good question.
Yeah, as far as prohibition goes, I mean, I think anybody who's kind of even a little bit intelligent knows that these drug laws don't work, right? And they never have. They're normally in place for other reasons, political reasons. The people that make these laws are the same people that sell all the drugs around, you know, around the planet anyway. So it's all a bit of a joke. So all, you know, to try to make a plant illegal is just so stupid. So that would be my kind of bottom dollar. There's all kind of therapies now, like they're looking at LSD to treat PTSD and very, you know, and marijuana and all this kind of stuff. I don't know how much is necessary, because it's hard you never get cured of trauma. How can you? That's like saying you've got to like forget this part of your life. And oh yeah, we all wish we could, but you can't forget, you know, being smashed around the head as a child, right? So I don't know. It then becomes really hard to know, when are you cured of it? You know, are you cured? Is it you just get a better relationship with it? I think that's probably it. You get a better relationship with the trauma, with the people involved, and how you deal with it yourself and your image. So as a specific marijuana, I say give them the marijuana before they join up, or when they join up. Definitely before each war, right? I don't smoke. I'm not saying this because I'm a smoker, but you know, I tell you a fascinating thing. In England, we have football hooligans, right? I'm sure you heard of this. So one football team has his fans, the other football team has their fans. They fight. They don't go to watch the football. They go to fight, right? Very violent. They carry knives. Bit like the Triads, you know, they just will fight. Well, when ecstasy came around, they couldn't fight because they were all hugging each other, you know, because it helps you to understand empathy and love and the things that are important in life. So these football hooligans were like, oh, hello, yeah, I'm fine, you know. So
time to give ecstasy to our combatants in war, right, Chris?
Well, let's just get rid of war because it only suits very few people in this world.
True. Okay, Sukima, you got a question for Chris?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering why people still take drugs, or why they're so popular even though they know drugs could potentially destroy them. Thank you.
Okay, well, Sukima, here's the thing. Unless you have a terrible accident, like you take an ecstasy pill and it's got some like kind of poison in it, or bad poison, drugs are relatively harmless. In fact, they're not just harmless, they're really great fun. And when you first take them, because you see your friends are all taking them and they're laughing and they're smiling and they're going, come on, come dancing, you know, and so you go and take one yourself and you dance all night, you have a brilliant time, you go home and sleep, and then you go to work. Well, you don't see any danger, because all your parents' generation have done is try to scare you about drug without educating you, just scare you. Drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs cause addiction, all this stuff that they really don't know what they're talking about. So of course you take one and you have a great time. You're like, huh? Why is this bad? I just danced with a guy that, you know, I probably would have used to not like, and you know, listening to this great music. You don't think it's bad, but you don't think it's bad. And for most people, we're talking now 90%, 95%, they won't be bad. They won't, not everybody gets addicted to drugs. Only a very small, you know, percentage of people like myself. And as I've already said, like, I've had a brilliant life, so I'm probably not the right person to, you know, I get it that people die occasionally, and that's is really sad, but that generally tends to be accidents and mismanagement of drug use, not drugs themselves, right?
And Suki, we'll get more into the difference between dependence and addiction. There's a big, you can be dependent on drugs without being addicted to them, using them to the point where, you know, they become necessary in your physical functioning every day, but not necessarily be affected by drugs as a disease, as an addiction. And we'll talk more about that.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Quinn, you got a question for Chris? Quinn? Okay, Tiffany, how about you? Tiffany?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Okay.
So my question is about what do you think the UK government can do to help people who used to abuse drugs, and how the government can help them regain their positions in society? Thank you.
Okay. Obviously there's two questions there. There's, are the government willing to do it in the first place? Which, no, because the government just, they run this line, you know. This line helps the very rich people in the world, doesn't help people like us, and it's not supposed to, you know. So that's the first point, is politicians, they don't work for me and you. They work for the bankers and the elitists. And these bankers and elitists are the ones that sell all the drugs. So already there's this, you know, this paradox, you know. You know, a lot of these elitists are just a mafia to themselves. As far as your question, yeah, I mean, of course, there's massive amounts. First of all, legalization, so that drugs can be bought safely and people understand what they're buying. And of course, that doesn't mean everyone's going to run out and take drugs, which is what people usually say, because like my grandmother, well, my grandmother's dead, but you know, you get my point. She's not going to go out and start raving at 85 years old. My dad's too busy with his work, say, you know. So regulation, then the drugs can be tested. You know exactly what you're getting, so you're not going to overdose or poison yourself and die. This kind of thing. We need to stop criminalizing people for being ill, which is what a mental health condition is. You know, I needed help. I didn't need to be put in prison. It would have done me worse, right? Imagine being in prison mentally unwell, which is what we do. Lots of prisoners suffer addiction. It's a mental health condition. Plus, even worse, you know, worse sort of side effects of that. And rather than help and support them and say the stuff that I've been saying to you today, no, we lock them, you know, in a room for 5 years, and we think that that's, and we lock them in a room with the biggest drug dealers in the country, because they're all in prison too, and the guards in the prison are selling the drugs as well. You know, it's such a it's stupid. Oh, and one sec, just in a call, okay? Yeah. Can I? Shall I? I'll do it. I'll do it. Bye. Love you. Bye.
Hey, Chris.
Bye.
I know we've gone over our time period right now.
Yeah.
Maybe about 10 more minutes and we'll wrap it up. Or do you have that much time?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
okay,
fine.
we might be able to get through the rest of our questions here with that. Lee Kwan, you have a question for Chris?
Oh yeah, I think due to a different health situation, some of the substance users may not have adverse events like the true blame. Therefore, is there any way to let them aware their drug taking issue? And which approach you think that is more effective to tackle drug addiction problem? Like zero tolerance approach like Hong Kong government, or the harm reduction approach in other countries? Thank you.
Oh, hi Lee Kwan, thank you. It's like I say, please, if you take one thing away from today, is there's never a simple answer. And it's so, you know, please remember, addiction is not a bad thing. It's not something you should be like afraid of. It's not something that you should think makes you a bad person. I'm saying addiction because that's kind of like the known worst side effect of drugs, right? Is addiction. I say that because in the UK, we have harm prevention. So we get people that are struggling on heroin. They have no money left. Some of them are spending 6,000 Hong Kong dollars a day, and they're stealing all of that money from shops and people and cars and this kind of thing, right? Well, clearly that is unsustainable. They cannot carry that behavior forever. They're going to end in prison. You know, they're going to get fed up having to go stealing every single day. So what do we do in this country? And I'm just putting the argument here. This is not me. This is just the argument is we reward them by giving them free drugs, which is methadone, right? Now, on the other hand, if you've got somebody that is addicted to, let's say, heroin, and they are a family person, they got addicted to it, they didn't mean to, well, none of us meant to, but you know, it's a real bad accident. They got to look after 3 children, they got to go to work. Well, then maybe methadone is much, you know, that can maybe save their life. It could stop them having their children taken away from them by the social services, this kind of thing. So this is how complicated the situation is. For me, I was lucky. I was young, I was single, I had no children. Had I had children, it could have been awful. You know, they would have been taken away from me. And that's quite rightly so, because I couldn't have looked after them. So yeah, I'm sorry. It's just got to be a coordinated, constructive, pragmatic approach to each individual situation.
Okay, Chris, we're going to wrap up. This is going to be the final question, and this is a bit of my own bias here. Anaga, you got a question that references BoJack Horseman, so I'm going to finish with you since I'm a big fan of the show.
Hi.
Hi.
So I've been watching BoJack Horseman. I'm in the last season now. So right now, like BoJack Horseman's in an alcohol addiction rehabilitation center, and like because of it, I've been questioning the how practical it is to join 12-step programs and whether they're actually like, you know, effective and everything. So because you seem like someone who advocates the use of psychoaddictive substances to achieve that kind of euphoria, at least like to some extent, do you think such programs are like necessary? And if at all they're necessary, do you think they're effective?
Oh, okay. First of all, just to clarify, I only advocate people live their lives and that they don't tell me how to live mine. If you can do it without drugs, I'm so happy for you. Okay, please try, you know, please try, but also remember that for people like me, had I not taken a drug, excuse my language, but I'd still be a bit of an asshole. And I'd have to go through my whole life being an asshole. And I still am a bit, you know. It's the human curse, right? So, but your question is a very valuable one, because a lot of these organizations don't really help. Statistically, for people that go to Alcoholics Anonymous, let's say for every 100 that go, 90 just continue drinking. It's really tough. I found it tough in my own life. I mean, I drank and took drugs every day, for argument's sake, for about 27 years. And then when I become a father, I've just got to stop it, you know. I'm not talking like hard, what you call hard drugs all the time, but alcohol, the worst drug. I would drink a lot, you know. I'd drink in the morning, I'd drink in the afternoon. I just like drink. I thought I liked drinking, but here's the thing. It's everyone's on their own journey, and different treatment solutions can, even if it's a temporarily, help different people. The problem, let's call it the issue with the 12-step program, is it's very outdated. It comes from a time where people didn't use science. They just used like God and fear. It's very stigmatizing for people like myself. I don't want to be called an addict for the rest of my life. Even if I was, how is that going to help me? How is that going to help my self-esteem, the way my kids look at me? Yeah, don't call me an addict. Call me a pilot or a runner or an idiot, but don't call me addict. It's so disrespectful, right? And that's what the 12-step program is. They think that is their rock, you know. Hey, I'm an alcoholic. I'm this kind of thing, right? So that's another issue. The language we use is so powerful. I'm a youth worker. I studied, my degree is in youth work. It's so important you understand language. You know, we weren't allowed to say ladies. It's women, men and women, not men and ladies, you know. It's very important. So that's another issue. The other thing is they see relapse as failure. And I'm talking generally here. There's very different AA groups around the world, you know. There's many different types, apparently so. But the one I went to, like, if you relapsed, you have to hold your hand up, throw yourself to God and say, I'm so sorry, I was wrong. And well, what I teach myself is, you know, relapsing is the biggest part of the learning. That's when you learn. You get back to this place, you go, do you know what? I said I wasn't going to come here again because I'm bad to my family. I'm not paying my bills. My house is a mess. I don't feel happy. I'm anxious. I'm depressed. I didn't want to be here. And yet I'm drinking again, right? Or I'm smoking or whatever. Do you know what? I got to go around the cycle of change. You know, I got to start again. And that's what makes you stronger and gives you better resolve. So, yeah. So that's kind of my feelings on the 12-step program. I wouldn't stop anybody doing anything if it helps them, right? But I think the 12-step, you know, they treat addiction as an illness, and addiction is not an illness. Addiction is a learned mental health condition, or a learned pattern of behavior. So it's like the mouse in the cage. You give him a biscuit, the mouse pushes a button, he gets a biscuit. So what does he do? He pushes a button, he gets a biscuit. He pushes a button, he gets a biscuit. If you take that biscuit away, what does the mouse do? He keeps pushing the button because he's learned if he does that, he'll get a reward, okay? And what you have to do in recovery is you have to teach yourself that biscuit was never really a reward in the first place. It was just kind of like a poison, right? You know, there was some good stuff, but that's kind of not my point. And you have to reprogram your mind. But your colleague here came up with a very important point. The older you get, the more years you've been doing this, pushing the button, you get this rigidity in your mind. Allegedly, nobody can prove it. They call it neuroplasticity. Like the ability of your brain to create new neural pathways change. And the older you get, these allegedly become solid, fixed, so you can't change your behavior as easy as when you were young. This is when the 12-step program kind of can be good, I'm going to say it, because if you just can't stop drinking, and I've had 2 best friends now drank themselves to death. You wouldn't even know they were drinkers. Completely, you know, my friend that died was buried last week. He drank himself to death a month before. Professional businessman, very nice man, very funny. And he was at that age though, where even when his liver stopped working and his body went like this, because it couldn't get rid of the poisons and it's storing it in the water, even then, he not only couldn't admit he had a drinking problem, but he couldn't take any action. And for people like that, 12-step program is probably, you know, a good way ahead.
Yeah, Chris, and with that answer, you've left us at a good point. One of our other course questions is whether addiction is actually a disease or a behavioral issue. And so that's something that we'll continue to debate. You've been incredibly generous with your time and really grateful for all these questions that you've answered. Students, stay on the line after Chris checks out. We've got a couple of housekeeping things I want to take care of. But one thing I wanted to mention just to wrap things up, one of the points that I took away from your book that I thought was really interesting is that drug use, as you mentioned throughout this session, was only part of your identity, part of your experience that made you who you are. And throughout your books and throughout your talks, you've never expressed any hatred of yourself or who you were during that time period or during now. And that kind of healthy regards, healthy self-esteem, no matter where you are in your life, is incredibly important for any kind of recovery, any kind of moving forward. So I think that's one of the major points that you brought out, and I'm glad that you were able to do that. Thomas de Quincey, who wrote Confessions of an Opium Eater in 1821, was kind of the godfather of the addiction memoir. But you, with your books, have taken it to an interesting level, a place where we actually can learn where we are today. So thank you for that. Thank you for all the time that you spent with us, and I think the students and I and Nita have all benefited greatly. I'm going to leave them with a little shot of your video jumping out of the plane. But Chris, thanks again for all your time.
Friend, thank you for watching my video. I'm the only person I know that has ticked every item off my bucket list, and I did so coming back from chronic addiction with no help from anybody. Now I want to pass those skills on to you, but I can't help you unless you help me and hit the subscribe button. So please do so, and let's go and smash this world together.